Dyslexia Nation, this video is about Horselexia. I'm gonna get to what that means in a second. Now, I've been thinking about this idea for a while, and I think I finally figured out how to put it all together. This is gonna be rough, and it might take me a while to explain it to you guys, but it's a pretty beautiful idea. I don't think anyone has explained this dyslexia in these terms before, so hopefully this will give you a new perspective on how to look at how our brains work and how that's related to how society views reading and how our industrial school systems treat dyslexics and all those different things. I'm gonna try to link all these ideas together in this video. Hopefully you guys will enjoy it. But these are just my raw thoughts and a theory that I came up with called Horselexia. So basically, before we get to Horselexia, we gotta talk about dyslexia. So basically, dyslexia is a way that our brain anatomy works. We have as a dyslexic, we have a difficult time using our eyeballs to read something, and by reading the symbols on a page, get the thoughts or ideas into our head, transferring the words into thoughts in our head using our eyeballs. That's the main crux of the issue with dyslexics. They have a hard time reading, right? Now, I think dyslexia, it's not something that has been around for a long time. I think it was only the word dyslexia first appeared in medical textbooks and stuff like that. I think maybe 60 years ago or something. That's from what I read. So before that, they didn't even have a word for our difficulty, right? And I think that's completely normal and completely natural because of how reading has progressed through time. So basically, reading didn't used to be super important 200, 300, 400 years ago. So back in the 1700s, 1800s, a lot of people didn't have access to books. And before Gutenberg's press, it was really expensive to produce books, right? Because you'd had to do it by hand. So if you wanted to make a duplicate of a book, what you would have to do is you would have to get some monks or you hire some illiterate people, and you'd have to have them sit in a room somewhere, and they would transcribe. They would take a book, and they would read the page, and then a guy would sit there and write down what they wrote, what they saw, and draw the pictures from what they saw into this thing, and then they would do that over 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, over a year sometimes, and then that labor would turn into this book. So back in those days, it would take a person who's literate, a person that knows how to read, a year to duplicate a book. So books were really expensive. So not a lot of people had access to books. And on top of that, there wasn't really that much need for books because people's everyday lives didn't depend on gaining new knowledge. It was mostly passed down by apprenticeship. Since most people in society didn't have to read, this thing about dyslexia wasn't an actual disease. It wasn't thought of as a disability. But as more and more people started reading, after the Gutenberg's press was invented, after the Enlightenment era and all that stuff was happening, books became more relevant, right? Books became the #1 way society was able to kind of index itself, right? So whenever someone learned something, they would put it in a book, and whoever was interested in that subject would read all these books and treatises on this particular subject to become knowledgeable on any field. So in that way, books have been super important, and it's been one of the best inventions in order to save knowledge as humans have progressed. But the problem comes when books is so important, and learning things becomes so important that if you're lacking this ability to read a piece of information from a book and to gain that knowledge, if you don't have that, you are at a huge disadvantage. So first of all, reading is a skill, right? So you can learn it, and as you get better at it, you're able to do that better and better until you get to the point where you're able to, without even thinking about it, just open a book and get that information. Now, that skill, there was a skill just as important as reading it is to us today, that back in the medieval times was to those people. And the skill that I'm talking about was riding horses and working with animals. So back in those days, if you were not able to ride a horse and take care of a horse, deal with animal husbandry around horses, then you were at a huge disadvantage, because that society really relied on horses, just like our society really relies on reading and books, and passing down knowledge through the written form. So what I'm saying is, back in those days, if you were not able to ride a horse, then you were at a huge disadvantage, because, like, let's say that you wanted to be a farmer, or you wanted to be a knight, or you wanted to go to war, or do things that involve horses. If you couldn't do it, some other person is able to do it better than you, and they can outcompete you. And in that society, if you didn't have that skill, you were kind of like screwed, right? So if you were a knight and another knight was able to ride a horse better than you, and you had an advantage, and the person that didn't have an advantage, well, they were like kind of like Horselexia, right? They weren't able to do this thing that everyone else is able to do. So these Horselexics were not able to function in that society, in the medieval society, as well as other people, because they had this deficit. They had this thing a skill that everyone else had that they didn't have. But let's take that person. Let's say there was there's a kid who was not able to ride a horse, and let's say that kid was a Horselexic, and we can transport them into today's time. Would that kid still have Horselexia? Well, yeah, they would still have physiological or cognitive disabilities that would make it hard for them to ride horses, but that problem wouldn't be as prevalent for them in today's society, because the reason why people needed to use horses was because they needed to use animal like horsepower, like use the energy that this animal had in order to do something useful for them, right? And in today's society, we have like cars and engines and things that kind of enable us to use energy that's not from animals but from chemicals, right? So in today's society, if you were Horselexic, it wouldn't really matter, because you can just get a car or a tractor or another machine that can kind of do the things that a horse used to be able to do. And now in today's society, these machines are way better than like a horse, right? It wouldn't even matter if you're a Horselexia. All right, now let's talk about how that's related to dyslexia. So for the last couple hundred years, reading has been like the #1 way to get information into our brain, right? And the cool thing about reading is you not only are you able to get information into your brain, but you're also able to transport information to different locations, and you're also able to transmit information into the future. So if you wrote down a book, if you wrote down that book in America, you can send that book to England, and someone from England could have the ideas inside your head. You can transport the ideas inside your head all the way across the ocean, and that person will have access to what you wrote down. And also another thing is, like, someone 100 years from now can read the book you wrote and be able to understand it, so that we can transmit information into the future. So that's a really cool thing. But that's just like how horses allowed people to travel and give them access to animal power. Books give people access to information. But I think that equation is kind of changing as technology progresses. So I want to kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about here. So on this side, let's draw a thing here. On this side, let's call this technology, and on this side, let's call it skills. And I hope you guys can see that. But let's say that with time, the amount of skill that's necessary to do a job, for let's say this is traveling, right? So back in the days when people were just riding horses, it took a lot of skills, because maybe when horses were first getting domesticated, you needed to be able to ride like wild horses, right? And then over time, humans started getting the ability to domesticate these things. So the skill of riding a horse gets lower and lower. And then maybe 100 years after horses were domesticated, people figured out how to make like really good saddles. So the skill drops again. And then after another 100 years, people started really figuring out the genetics of horses and which type of horses was able to, work with humans. So the skill of riding a horse or being able to travel using a horse gets lower and lower as time and technology progresses. And it gets to the point where there is like a revolution. You know, in the 1920s, you know, New York City used to have a bunch of horses. Like the streets were full of horses, but then this is shortly after when the Model T was made. There was like this revolution where, you know, some people were using horses, some people were using cars. You know, there was like the skill of riding a horse is, you know, it was a lot. It was probably comparable, right? It was like if you were able to ride a horse, you probably had to use the same cognitive and physical abilities that you needed to drive a car back in those days. But the really cool thing about cars is that you can make huge improvements. Since you're not using genetics to improve the horse, you're kind of using like engineering to improve this car. People were really decreasing the skill necessary to like to drive a car. And now what's happening is, you know, from getting from point A to B is the problem, right? That's what we're trying to solve. So now what's happening is, you know, Tesla and like Google and all these other companies, they're creating like automated cars or cars that can drive themselves. So the skill is getting even lower and lower and lower. And Uber and all these other services is getting to the point where all you have to do from A to B is press a button, and then your car, you know, in the future, your car will come pick you up and it will drop you off. So the skill of actually traveling from A to B almost goes to zero, right? So it used to be really hard when horses were first getting domesticated, but as technology and time progresses, the skill goes to zero, and the access or the ability for people to do this thing also becomes like almost universal. And what I'm saying is, at this point right here, where the skill is kind of difficult, is when you have like disabilities. For example, like, you know, in the case that we came up with, you know, I call this thing Horselexia, because there's a high skill requirement to be able to do this. And if you lack this ability, then you have a disadvantage in that society. So a lot of people were probably spending a lot of time learning how to ride horses. So if there was like a school system in the medieval times, a lot of it would be like figuring out how to use this technology to like travel, and how to use this technology to you know, farm and things like that. And the same thing could be applied to like reading. So reading is not like, it's just like any skill. You're trying to serve a function. So when you're reading something, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get, you know, information from the world. So this is the world, and you're trying to get it inside your brain, right? And reading is just one way that we know how to do that. So back in the days, the way people did that was they, you know, observed the world and then they told someone. But that was not very good, because you had to be in that place to listen to that person in order to pass that information. And also, they weren't able to like record their thoughts and ideas perfectly. So some people lost a lot of that knowledge. So writing and keeping records was invented, and after that, it became so important to be able to read. So, but only a few people were able to do that. But then we got to about here when the industrial age came, and during the industrial age, it became really important because, you know, technology was changing so fast that we had to be able to update our knowledge of things. So like, to go from a farmer to like a factory worker, you needed to get a lot of different information into your head. So reading became super important, and this is when dyslexia was invented, right? Especially with like when we were like bootstrapping like communication technologies like computers and newspapers and telecommunications and railroad networks and things like that. You know, sending information back and forth and being able to communicate with each other became really important. So this is when dyslexia started like becoming a thing, when more and more of the population started learning how to read. It really became a issue for those people that didn't know how to read. And this is when the school systems started really pushing like reading and math, because that was like the most important thing that, you know, someone in that society needed to be able to function. But now we're getting to the point where reading is not the only way to get information from the world into our brain. With multimedia technology, especially with like audio technology, I can read a book using an audio book way faster than if I was just reading it. Also, like, I rather watch a YouTube video than almost any other way to learn, right? That's because I'm a dyslexic, and I think as technology progresses, it's going to be more and more like that. So, when I was growing up, everyone used a textbook to learn things, but now, we have access to computers, and it's really easy to get access to like videos and audiobooks and things like that. And I think later on, maybe 50 years from now, even audiobooks and videos will be kind of going away, and we might be like, to learn something, we might enter like a virtual reality type environment where you can like learn from doing things and experiencing things. So I think this is when this idea of dyslexia is going to go away, right? People don't talk about horselexia anymore because it's not a thing. You don't really need to learn how to ride a horse anymore because our technology has moved past that skill, right? We just need to go from A to B, and we can do that using Uber and stuff like that. I think 50 years from now, or even maybe 20 years from now, dyslexia will not be a thing people talk about. I mean, it's really cool that we have like this awesome advantage in the way we think, but all the disadvantages are kind of disappearing, and that's kind of like this idea of how we get to have all the advantages and not have any of the disadvantages, because technology is going to be far, far more improved. All right, you guys, I hope you guys like this. I know this is like a longer type video, and I didn't really prepare for it. If you like this, leave it a like and a comment. If you have any questions, I have a lot more things to say about this, but I don't really know how to organize it in a way that would make sense in this context. But I am going to spend a lot of time on this idea because I think it's interesting. So you guys, love you. Talk to you soon.